Hello and good evening, I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Joining us on the show tonight, we have Lim Mah Hui from the civil group Penang Forum. Now, in his career, he's been an academic, a financial consultant and a Penang local government councillor. His new book is titled Local Democracy Denied? A personal journey into local government in Malaysia. I'd like to welcome him to the show. Hello, Mah Hui. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
I would like to begin our conversation tonight with perhaps a look at the economy first. Now, Mah Hui, you were formerly with the Asian Development Bank, and you've written extensively about the global economy and financial crises. Now, I'm wondering, Mah Hui, in your opinion, how should we be thinking about the duration and the severity of the economic crisis stemming from this pandemic?
Yes, at the outset, I would say we should not underestimate both these dimensions. In fact, I think today, Anthony Fauci, the chief fellow who is in the US, saying that this is one of his worst nightmares, and he asked us to basically to still pay a lot of attention to it. Now, in terms of severity, I mean, it is very widespread. Within a couple of months, no country was spared the infection, right? Although, of course, the mortality rate is much lower. And in terms of the severity of the economic crisis, it is very intense. Hopefully, it might not be too long-lived. It's intense in terms of a disruption of supply lines or supply chain in the beginning. But then when governments began to institute the lockdown measures to contain the health problems, then it led to almost a total collapse of demand in particular industries such as air travel, entertainment, hotels, and all that. So I think it is very, very severe. And in terms of the longevity, it really depends on two things. One is how diligent the public is to continue to, undertake health precautionary steps and all that to make sure that, we don't spread it around. The second would be the mutation of the virus. And finally, whether a vaccine can be found soon. I think those are the three factors.
Right, Mah Hui, if we could, just kind of focus on the question of economics and global economics and those dynamics. Even before the pandemic struck many of the economies of Europe and East Asia, there were already tensions, weren't there? I mean, we had the trade war between China and the US. We have all kinds of other attendant issues along with the question of the price of oil. How much do you think these other factors play into the problems that we are seeing now in terms of the impending recession, or the recession that's already here, as it were?
Yes, I think, we are already at the close end of a bull run of not only the financial markets, but even of the economic, growth. And I think we should look at what is the economic and financial landscape when this, pandemic hit us. In some ways, it could not come at the worst time, as I said, because of the slowing down of growth, and also this after the great financial crisis of 2008, the financial system is slightly better in terms of the banking health, and the banks were stronger. But in terms of the total debt that the world took on, it is much more. Before the financial crisis, it was something like maybe 240% of GDP. Today, it's about 320% of GDP. And GDP is that, sorry,
right,
world GDP.
If I could just interrupt you to clarify something. So earlier you said not to underestimate the severity of this crisis. And if we were to take into consideration this kind of perfect storm of events, and then, during this time of the pandemic, does that mean that we can make comparisons to previous financial crises? Are there parallels to make, or is this a completely new, unprecedented impact of the pandemic?
We can make some comparisons, but this is not yet a financial crisis. This is a crisis that was born out of, a health crisis, which, of course, cascaded into economic crisis, which I stated earlier, where you have a lockdown and almost, total shutdown of the economy. And therefore, a lot of people didn't have income. Unemployment shot up in a matter of 2 months in the U.S. to over 20%. And therefore, and somebody stated that it is like a combination of the Spanish flu and the Great Recession in terms of severity. The only question is the duration, I think. Thus far, all the governments in the world have poured in, trillions of the dollars to try to rescue the economy and to prevent from it falling into the down the cliff. And it's fairly quite successful. But I think whether, I don't think there will be a V-shaped recovery. We will have some kind of recovery. The major imponderable and challenge is whether we will have a second wave of outbreak. If that happens, then then there's no holds barred. Then it'll be very difficult.
Mah Hui, I do want to come back to, this word unprecedented is very interesting. It gets bandied about a lot, perhaps overused, because we do have precedents in history when it comes to both pandemics and also economic crisis. And there are patterns generally, aren't there, with regard to growth. The economy, as it were, goes up and goes down, if I could just paraphrase. But I want to ask you, in terms of how governments respond, what are you seeing happening? Are we seeing the same patterns? Are governments using the same strategies they've used in the past to deal with economic recessions, pump priming, all these kinds of things? Or are they looking at other types of strategies?
I think they're using some same tools, but others are different. For one thing, during the global financial crisis, which was basically a banking and financial crisis, the government, especially in the United States and Europe, poured in money to recapitalize banks and also to throw liquidity lifelines to the banks, so that things don't get out of hand. But there was some degree of fiscal pumping and all that. But today, as I said, the impact and the severity was at a much higher level. And they are now doing something which 10 years ago, during the financial crisis, they did not do. In layman's terms, they said they are having helicopter money. Essentially, the central bank printing or supplying money, and as well as the government, to prop up the economy. And in the global financial crisis, it was helicopter money, but basically to the financial sector to prop up. But today, this helicopter money is given to households, to businesses, to try to tide over this crisis, liquidity crisis, right, which we hope will not become an insolvency crisis.
Well, so, we're
Yes.
going to have to take a quick break, but let's continue this conversation in just a couple minutes. And I also want to bring the conversation home as to how the economic fallout from the pandemic is impacting Malaysia and our economy. So stay tuned to consider this. If you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me, Sharad Kutan. We're speaking tonight to Lim Mah Hui from the civil society group Penang Forum. Mah Hui, if we can pick up the conversation where we left off, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on the Malaysian economy. Now, do we have the policy ammunition here in Malaysia to respond effectively to the damage that's done by the COVID-19 crisis? When we talk about the capacity and the constraints that policymakers have, what's that in the Malaysian context?
Yes, I think Malaysia has done fairly well, in terms of trying to respond to this crisis. First of all, the institution, our health institution, is quite strong, and we have a good health bureaucracy, as well as system that is able, public system, as well as private health sector, which is able to face this challenge. Now, and what are the other institutions that is fairly strong is the banking sector. After the global financial crisis, of course, it is much stronger. That the non-performing loans are quite low, and the capital adequacy and reserves that the banks have are quite good. But having said that, I mean, there are still some areas of concern where, for example, the household debt in Malaysia is quite high. It's about almost 90% of the GDP. And also the corporate debt is quite high. There is a recent study done by the McKinsey in Singapore, which places Malaysia somewhere in between the strong countries and the weak countries. And they highlighted 3 or 4 areas where there is a high stress. For example, the corporate debt is quite high, and the profitability of the corporate sector can be under stress. As I said just now, the household debt is also quite high. And the third is that the foreign debt is also relatively high. And the share of foreign loans with terms of less than 1% is something like around 40%. So there are some, strong sectors, but then there are some areas which we need to be concerned about.
Okay.
Mah Hui, I wonder though, one of the platitudes that comes out of a crisis like this is that crisis is also an opportunity to reform, strengthen, rethink some of the structural conditions which we operate and the state operates. And I know that you wrote a book in 2010 reflecting on the 2008 crisis, Nowhere to Hide, the great financial crisis, the challenge for Asia. Do you think this pandemic is an opportunity for Malaysia to pivot, change its strategy in terms of development, change its strategy in terms of, we mentioned helicopter money earlier, experimenting with universal basic income, for instance? Are these opportunities that present themselves now because of the crisis?
Yeah, I mean, every major crisis presents opportunities, for change. And in fact, change seldom comes unless society or individuals are faced with crisis. Then they begin to think what went wrong and what should we do. Just like, U.S. is facing not only the pandemic crisis, but the crisis of institutional racism. Yes, I think, the financial sector on a global level, particularly in the US, and I guess in Malaysia, we should rethink, the role of finance in the economy. Finance is a very important, credit and finance are important institutions in a modern economy. We couldn't live without it. And finance should be existing to serve the real economy. But as I've written in the book 10 years ago, which still I think is very relevant today, finance has become a big, huge speculative bubble. Instead of serving the real economy, it is whipsawing the real economy and putting the real economy into a tailspin and crisis almost every 10 years. In fact, we are long overdue for the next financial crisis.
Right.
And it is possible that this, what you call health crisis, which is also an economic crisis, could lead us down the path of a financial crisis.
Okay.
And therefore, I think, as I said, we need to do fundamental reforms to our financial sector. The other thing that is very important, the imbalance in society, is this whole question of wealth distribution. Yes, neoliberal growth has, made us much richer and the economy growing much faster. But most of the benefits of growth accrue to only the top 10, and in fact even maybe 1 or 5–10% of the population. And this cannot continue forever. Not only is it not good for growth in the long run, it is also will bring about social and political dislocation.
Right.
And so we do have to address this.
Yeah.
As to the basic universal income, I mean, the idea is good. I do not know if Malaysia is in that position to introduce it, but definitely Malaysia is in the position to make sure that we have a much more robust wage system, where that wages should increase more substantially with any increase in productivity. As you see in Malaysia, I think the wage component of our GDP is something around 35 to 40%, and that's way too low. That means profit component is about 65%, and that has to be redressed.
Okay. Well, Mah Hui, we're going to take another quick break, but after this, I want to continue the conversation, this time pivot a little bit and look at local government elections. Let's discuss that in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Thank you for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Lim Mah Hui from Penang Forum. His new book is titled Local Democracy Denied, a personal journey into local government in Malaysia. Mah Hui, I want to discuss governance at the local government level. Now, does the present pandemic highlight the need for more devolved decision-making structures, or is it the opposite? Do we need more centralized political systems to deal with public health matters in a better way?
I think it's always a balance between the two. That we will have to have, certain things that are done at the federal level, and other things should be done at the local level. We are supposed to have a federal system, right? The three levels of government, which is federal, state, and local. But in reality, what we have is almost a very centralized, unitary federal system, with the federal government controlling practically, I would say 80–90% of revenue, as well as all the powers of government, which is very unhealthy. There is this, in politics, we call the principle of subsidiarity, which means essentially that, subsidiary functions or low-level functions and decisions should be devolved to the local government level. It should not be federalized. Let me give you an example. Transportation. Yes, of course, air transportation should be federal authority. You couldn't have. But, public transportation, that should be at the local level. Who determines the bus licenses, the bus routes, when they operate? That should not be federalized, but that is federalized. Or the whole question of, waste management system and water management system, that should be localized. But the government, federal government, has taken it all over. Now, coming back to health, I think, as I said, Malaysia has a relatively good health system. And yes, it's federal, but it is, and in terms of this pandemic, should it be more federalized or should it be localized? As I said, it should be, coordination between the two. Let me give you an example. Certain functions can be done better at the local level. For example, contact tracing, right? What better institutions and resources than to depend on the local government and local authorities to do the contact tracing, with, of course, we can help of state and federal government officials. So I think it's a matter of a balance between the two.
Mah Hui, you're in a very interesting position because you're out there in Penang. Penang has been a state in opposition to the federal government for some time, except for that short period when we had the Pakatan Harapan take over federal power. And you were a local councillor, and Penang has a long history of local government in the state. Why did you write this book, and what exactly are the key lessons you learned being a local councillor and the key message you want to put out there in terms of local government?
There are a couple of reasons why I wrote this book. The first is I wanted to put down on record, my experiences and what I learned and what I thought was good and bad, about local government. And the second is there's actually hardly any book written about local government. The only one that I know of are two. One is written by a British civil servant in 1949 called Local Government in Malaysia. And it is something which you cannot get, but somebody gave it to me, a copy. And it's a lot of information. And the other one that I could think of, a book, is a collection of articles by Goh Ban Lee, who had written his weekly or fortnightly column. Of course, there are articles here and there written, but practically no full book was written, and therefore I wanted to, fill that gap.
Just to interrupt very quickly, Mah Hui, why is there a lack of literature about this?
For a couple of reasons. One is because after the 1960s, local government elections was abolished. And most people don't even know that we used to elect local councillors to run the cities. And it was abolished because under the pretext of what you call the confrontation, the federal government abolished it because a number of key cities, such as Ipoh, Seremban, Malacca, and Penang, they were all captured by opposition government, and they were doing a pretty good job. And that was causing a lot of headache for the federal government, so they abolished it. So for that reason, I think, it became not sexy and people didn't know. And
Mah Hui, I do want to say, I put it out there that you have not had the happiest relationship with the Penang state government, whether under Lim Guan Eng or I don't know about how you are with Chow Kang Yeow. But why do you think political leaders have trouble, giving away power to local groups or even including local groups like the Penang Forum in conversations that essentially about how to improve things?
Yeah, I think politicians want, is a special breed of people. They basically want to monopolize power, and they talk about democracy, but they don't practice it. Now, one of the important message I'm trying to bring across in my book, and that can be found in the last chapter, is that democracy is not simply about election. Most people, I'm sure 90% of the people you ask, what is democracy? It means going to election, which means you're going to cast your vote once every 4 or 5 years, and after that you go back to your house and you're supposed to shut up, and then you're supposed to trust the politicians to run the show. But that is only one small facet of democracy, what I call electoral democracy, elections. Actually, a more fundamental aspect of democracy is participation, people's participation. The root word of democracy originates from Greece, demos and kratia, which means people's rule or people's power. During those periods, right? I mean, cities were small, and therefore people could gather in the marketplace, and they could discuss, and they could banter, and they could debate, and then come to decisions. So
Right.
people, was basically directly involved in democracy, and this is what we will call participatory or direct democracy, as opposed to election.
I think it's a very important message to talk about citizens' participation in democracy. Thank you so much, Mah Hui, for talking to us a little bit about that tonight and for joining us on the show. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, so thank you for your time. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching for this episode of Consider This. Good night.